the Bible was fundamental to our survival.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Hello and welcome to the Profile podcast. You're going to be hearing the most incredible testimony today of David Donovan, a medical missionary working in Nigeria, how he was kidnapped and held at gunpoint for 22 days. How the Bible, in his words, was fundamental to his survival, and what he learnt about God's sovereignty, even in the most testing and trying of circumstances. Just before we head into that interview, wanted to let you know that I am the editor of Premier Christianity magazine. That's the UK's leading Christian publication. We publish every single month, and the story you're about to hear is in the latest issue of the magazine, plus loads more interviews and features, reviews, the latest analysis on church trends, and so much more. So if you do want to pick up a copy, you can request one absolutely free of charge at premierchristianity.com. But for now, let's listen into this incredible testimony. This is David Donovan talking about his experiences in Nigeria. Let's listen in. David, thank you so much for talking to us. I'd love to start a little bit with your own personal story. Can you tell me something of how you first became a Christian?
Once I was given a tract at a music festival when I was 16, and at the time there was something intrinsic in it that I recognised was important, and I kept that tract. In fact, I still have it, and I considered it. It was called Help from Above, and it was just Bible verses pertaining to different situations of life. And the university, I still had the tract on me, and I took it out at that time and considered it, and went to the Word and felt it was speaking directly to me. And at the time I was going to a Neelam church in Edinburgh, and it was there at a gospel service at 6:30 on November when I was 20 that I gave my life to Christ.
And making that decision has had pretty massive kind of consequences in your life since then. And we'll talk about what happened when you were a missionary in Nigeria. But before we get there, do you remember what were the kind of immediate consequences for you? I mean, what changed because of that decision to follow Jesus in your life?
It would be nice to say it was a binary change from black to white, but, we are in the world even though we're not of the world. And the university, and then I retrained as a doctor, married with children. The world comes in, and I think if I look back, I had 20 years of self-deception in a way of thinking I was Christian, when in actual fact I was very much half in the world and a nod and a wink to my faith. I hadn't really counted the cost at that time. And I think that leads to a permanent sense of restlessness and dissatisfaction, because you neither enjoy the blessings of walking with Christ and maturing in your faith, but also you partake of things in the world with just a sense of dis-ease and, I wouldn't say guilt, but just unease, that there's something else that is calling you. And it was only after 20 years that God arrested us as a couple, and I think demanded a review and a seriousness of, choose this day whom you will serve. And at that point, I wholeheartedly decided to follow Christ. And I think that's always a danger in Christianity, that we see it in a cultural way instead of actually counting the cost, as it says in Colossians. We are dead and hid with Christ in God. If we're truly dead, then it is it just changes everything. As Hudson Taylor said, if Christ is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. And for me, I think it took 20 years to really understand the significance of giving your life to Christ.
Was there anything in particular that really made you realise that and made you count the cost?
I think it was a review of where I stood with my marriage, where I stood with my children, where I stood with my work, and I think there was unhappiness on all fronts, and I think at that point I realized I needed to confront who I was. Was I the person I thought I was, or in Christ, was I somebody for whom the debt had been paid? And when I laid everything down on myself and said, Lord, just take me and renew me and let me see who you are, at that point I realized that laying it all down was what I had to do. I was holding on to everything, and that was a disaster on all fronts of my life.
Was that decision to count the cost? I mean, people use different phrases, don't they? Take your faith more seriously, become closer to God, that sort of thing. Is that then connected to your decision to go to Nigeria and become, both you and your wife, become missionaries?
Very much so, hence the term New Foundations. It was a new foundation for us. It was a new foundation for the people who we work with, and certainly a new foundation for delivering healthcare in that particular area in Nigeria, where there just isn't any. So that was... It came incidentally, though. Coming to Christ is not about establishing a work or rushing off to the mission field or some grandiose gesture. That came out of a far more important decision, and that was to choose this day who I was going to serve, and that was Christ. And the expression of that and going to Nigeria came out of that and very much led of God. It was not our idea at all.
What was it about Nigeria specifically? Did you have any kind of connection to the country beforehand? How did God lead you to that part of the world specifically?
No, absolutely. It's a place I've never been. We travelled a lot as a family, but never to that end of Africa. We were actually in a church in Falkirk, and we heard a Nigerian pastor just talking about, he was preaching, and at the end he just gave a little pixelated film of where he was from in the Delta. And it registered, and he was saying if there's anybody here who's involved in healthcare, but you hear that a lot as a doctor, there's always opportunities to go, there's always opportunities to serve and things, but for 6 months it just wouldn't leave us at all, and it just sort of grew. And there was in the November that Shirley said, if it's bothering us this much, we just ought to go. So we took our son out of school and bought tickets and flew over there. It was very much just acting on this sort of sense of pressure on the heart to actually respond to something difficult to articulate, but it was just a need to go.
Was that originally supposed to be a short-term thing?
It was literally, I thought it was just obedience, because, if something is gnawing at you, it's best to just go and check it out. Yeah. And so we went over there, and that was in a time of civil war. It was very hard indeed. And we met with the pastor who we had heard, and we stayed in a sort of a guarded hotel for a week because it was in curfew. But the last day, he hired a boat, and with some other pastors took us out to see communities in the Delta. And it was extraordinary. I mean, just something ignited us, and we just felt, first of all, utterly ill-equipped to respond to what we saw. The task was far beyond us, but there was just something, a seed that was planted, and we just felt here is where we ought to be. But beyond that, we couldn't understand how we could affect any change or bring any help or anything, because at the end of the day, it's just us. It's not an international organization or some sort of international aid or anything, and it's not about, the colonial ideas of missionary medicine and etc. are way gone. These are people, everyone has mobile phones and it's quite a developed area. I mean, it's all the politics of oil in that area, so it's not the animals and the savannas, it's the bling, it's the rap music, it's the oil and coke. It's a very different environment, so very corrupt area. So for us, it was just beyond our understanding. But I think the important thing is to say, like I say, here am I, send me. It was in our hearts to just say, Lord, whatever you want, we're prepared and quite happy to go. But beyond that, you're going to have to do everything.
So what was the next steps for you from that moment of understanding this was somewhere that God might be calling you?
Well, the next step was to count the cost and actually employ brain, because he gives us, responding to God's call is multifactorial, and there has to be a response in the heart, but then, he's given us a brain and to actually apply. And I thought, well, I'm a doctor, but I don't have any skills in tropical medicine, so I need to address that. We actually need to train some people here. So we advertised across local churches out there for 40 people. We would train for a year, and we would employ 20 at the end. And we did exactly that. We'd sold our house, we bought a boat out there, and partners with a doctor who we employed as well, a local doctor who knew the area well. He'd been a veterinary doctor in that area, coming and going himself. And so we trained up 20 who we employed, and then started a clinic from the boat, traveling around 14 communities on a regular basis. And we did that for about 7 years. But at the end of the day, you're coming in, it's a bun fight, hundreds of people. If somebody is there with a condition you can treat and you have the medication and they can get to the front of the queue, that's fine. But actually it doesn't change the health-seeking behavior of the people. It's chaotic, and also, more importantly, the opportunity to tell of the love of Christ and to bring the gospel, which ultimately was the purpose, was silenced in the Bedlam. So the Lord showed us very clearly that we needed to put our feet on the ground and actually develop a clinic, and that's what we began in 2007.
Just paint a picture for those of us who don't have any background in medicine, and also those of us who've never been to Nigeria. Paint a bit of a picture for us of what are the sorts of challenges that you find in a part of the world that is, I'm sure, very, very different to the UK in all sorts of ways. What were the unique challenges? What was difficult about it? But also share some of the stories where you saw God move, or where you saw some of those challenges overcome as well.
It is a difficult area. I think the biggest thing is perceptions. When you look at a situation, I'm looking at it from one angle, but my brother or sister over there is looking at it from a different angle, but we're looking at the same thing. So my view of it is different to them, although we're both staring at the same object, and therefore superficially it looks as though we're exactly on the same page. And that took a while to understand, actually, that people looked at us in a different way, because understandably in that area, bird in hand is far more important for these people, because you can't plan for tomorrow. So when people come with the opportunity of investing in a community and health and employment, then people have an urgency to try and partake of that. But our desire is to find people who are godly, who are seeking to serve their own people. So I think from culture, religion, what does it mean to be a Christian? In that area, it's often fused with a hybrid Catholicism and fetish medicine and paganism, in a sort of smorgasbord of belief that people say, I'm a Christian, but they clearly aren't. Their belief is different. So what it means to be a Christian is the first thing, which was a puzzle to us. We had to actually unpick that and actually see if we were all on the same page from a doctrinal point of view. And then I think colour, racism works the other way, and there's a real enmity to white people in that area because of the oil industry. So that was something we felt very, very tangibly. It's a very unsafe area. So that was something that was new to us, to be on the receiving end of hostility because of colour. And then education, wealth, and tribalism and culture. So these things are huge. And in missionary work, for us, the most important thing was to be relational, to simply try and break down all these things by just communication, relating to people, loving them and serving them without any precondition, without any judgment, and coming alongside them. So that's why we were very much grassroots. And there were times when we couldn't understand how people could be so predatory of their own people, and that for us was a big thing. How could people abuse their own people? One time we were doing an eye clinic, and we had got a cataract surgeon involved, and we had a whole lot of patients lined up. And then we were told there was no fuel in the generator for the microscope. Well, that was impossible because we had 4 big drums. And then it occurred to us that the community had been partying for 4 days, and they had come and stolen it and put it in for generators for films and dancing and music and all that sort of things. And yet their own people were lined up to get cataract surgery, but they couldn't because they'd stolen all the petrol. And that sort of thing stunned us. But equally, how God stepped into a situation was amazing, because through prayer, and this may be for a lot of people hard to understand, but we did see God move in ways I still cannot fathom, but in a sovereign way. Because on that day, when the lights cut and the man in charge of the power said, we have no kerosene or diesel, I should say, we prayed. And within 15 minutes, all the barrels were full. And we did all the operations, everyone received their sight, and we could not understand how this had happened. And we saw that on a number of times. Cancers healed, where I think this is impossible, I don't believe the scan, but then you look, and when you examine, the lump is no longer there, just as a result of prayer. Now, of course, that isn't every time. Many times, as we know, we pray and prayers aren't answered. And it proves to us that God is sovereign. In certain situations, he steps in, other times he doesn't. But that's for him to decide when and where, and for us to just accept that he is sovereign. So we saw God move in many ways. We saw him move in restoration, in breaking down barriers of understanding, so much so that, the people over there are very much our family. They're brothers and sisters in Christ, but we love them. And that, I think, is a miracle in itself. Yeah. Even those who haven't come to Christ, we still can see a relationship there.
So how many years were you working there before the kidnapping happened?
16.
16 years. And during those 16 years, you've mentioned a few things about security. I know when you first went there, I think you talked about the hotel being secure and guarded. And you've mentioned already it's a dangerous part of the world to be in. How much at the forefront of your minds were the issues of security, just on a day-to-day basis? Was this something that you were mindful of all the time, or was it that over the course of 16 years, you kind of almost got used to it?
Somebody said, your security is your profile. Many people over there, most people, engineers, have guards and the army who are seconded to protect them. And we don't have that because we're just a very small, charity. So, A, we don't even have the option of that. But B, we felt because we related to the people, and we were so vulnerable and so unattached to the oil industry, people would see there was no point in taking us because we just didn't have anything worth having. Hudson Taylor in China eventually opened his entire house up for people to come in and see because he didn't have anything, and that was a deal that actually allowed him to minister effectively. And for us, it was the same sort of thing. It was just sort of, here they are. If you want us, you can take us. But we're very aware of the dangers of that area. But normally it's in cities. We'd had sort of episode of carjackings in Lagos and other things, and gangs on the roads. But I always felt once you got out into the creeks, it's very different in Nigeria out there. It's much more rural and peaceful. I felt that was safe, and it was an illusion. It wasn't safe.
So let's talk about what happened on that fateful day. What are your memories of being taken away and being kidnapped? What do you remember of that night when that happened?
It was our last night, and we had just had our normal sort of farewell evening meal with the team. We'd gone to bed, and again, being aware of security. Our mission house is set behind an 8-foot wall. There's floodlights everywhere. The generators are on all night. with light everywhere. There are grills on the windows, the doors are metal. We have 2 guys who stay up all night to keep an eye on things. All the doors are locked and everything else, and the compound is secure. So we are aware, and we did our best to try and acknowledge the threats there. But we had gone to bed, and we had just heard this sudden pounding on the door, and we got out of our mosquito net, tried to put on the light, and realised there was no power at all. They'd cut the generator lines. And then after a few, huge bangs, we just heard the front door go. And then we just knew what was happening. It just could only be guys who were coming for us. And then we heard pounding on Ian's door, and eventually silence, and then a few blows on Alanna's door, and then silence. And then by this time we had just got sort of a pair of shorts on, and Shirley only had a top on and a pair of trousers, and that was it. And then they burst into our room, and they had sort of torches and cagoules and Wellington boots, guns, frantic, sort of very much high on drugs and agitated, and it was very unpleasant, inevitably, and we were sort of pushed out. The guys who had been up all night had been injured quite badly and were sitting on the steps. And then we were pushed across a field towards the river. And at this time of the year, it's about 8 foot of rain. So the river is right up to the bank, and there's a speedboat there. And the community was absolutely still, couldn't hear anyone, no lights on. We were put on the boat, and then we took off at speed. And they took us out towards the Atlantic, where a lot of the oil heads are, and the communities are very isolated indeed, more like encampments than anything. And that was where we were held, in a very sort of remote area.
So it was you and your wife and Ian, Squire. Were there others taken as well?
Yes, Alanna Carson, who's another optometrist who had come out under Ian's auspices. Ian ran a sister organisation, and that brought the gospel through eye care into Africa and South America. And he'd been doing the same thing for years. So he had invited Alanna to come out under the umbrella of his organisation, and he partnered with us in establishing an eye clinic. So that was her first time on mission, and she was 24.
So what do you think was the motivation for them taking you? Because as you mentioned already, I completely understand the mentality of, well, we're doctors, we're here to serve the community, we don't have much in the way of finances or resources. Why would anyone come after us? We're not attached to the oil industry, as you said. So I don't know if those thoughts were going through your mind at that moment, probably not, but even now, do you know the motivation for them coming to you, who are Christians and who are trying to serve and to love that community and trying to provide healthcare? What was the motivation for them coming after you?
Money, pure and simple. As I say, these guys were young men, and some of them middle-aged, and they'd made a lot of wrong decisions in their life. But I did understand after we got out, why people did these desperate things, because for a lot of people in that environment, it is just hopeless. There's no investment in that area, and hostage taking is lucrative. And normally, if you take, they're taking a politician's wife before us, and often members from oil terminals and things, and they hold them for a few days and let them go because the oil company pay. But the gang who took us, I don't think fully appreciated the fact that we were not affiliated to anyone.
Right.
And that proved a difficulty during our entire captivity.
So they assumed that you would have, serious amounts of money, either yourself or other people could put up serious amounts of money for the ransom. They were assuming that, I suppose.
Well, I can only assume, yes. They came for us because we were in a remote area, we were white, and it's a reasonable thing to think that if they take us on the whole, somebody is going to pay for us,
Yes.
and then we'll get it cash.
So tell me more about those. It was 22 days you spent in captivity. Tell me more about what happened, what was going through your mind, and what unfolded in that time.
After we lost Ian, we were moved, after they killed him, we were moved to a platform in a flooded area of the jungle. It was a clearing. The flood's about 6 to 8 feet deep, and it was just a pontoon with bamboo struts on and a sort of thatch frond roof. Sides were open, and we were on a mattress and not allowed to stand up or move about. We just had to sit there. And there was about 6 or 7 of them who stayed on the platform all day, and then the leader of the gang and maybe 10 or so others who came at night. So on a platform about 16 feet by 10, you had up to 17, 18 people, which is a lot, you know. And they would cook, and drugs were a big factor, alcohol, intimidation. And having lost Ian, the temptation is to turn away and become small and withdraw. But the Lord spoke very clearly to Shirley that we needed to turn and face them, which was not the easiest thing, but actually that was the best thing to have done, to actually engage. And the other thing, bless him, before Ian was killed, when a young man in a canoe asked if we needed anything, we said water. And he interjected, and a Bible. And that Bible proved to be the absolute key to the entire 22 days. A, because we didn't have anything else. And secondly, because we learnt that the Bible is sharper than a two-edged sword. It's also food, it's comfort, it's instruction, it's admonition, it's encouragement, it's a healing balm. It is everything that it says it is. And it has a power that we don't actually appreciate. So much so that actually the gang recognized that. And when they became increasingly intimidatory and agitated, we would just read the Bible usually aloud. And when they become loud, we would read it even more loudly. And they would get to the point where they would just give in and fall asleep. And one of them actually said, you know, when you read that book, an angel passes over. We said, why? And he said, because we all fall asleep. Who is this person who you follow? We said that this person is Jesus. And because we were able to speak, sometimes laugh, interject, communicate, it gave us the ability to witness to them because we didn't compromise in anything that we said. In fact, Shirley said at one time, you know, it was after a long time of goading us and threatening us with violence and things. And she said, look, if you're going to shoot us, shoot us. But I'll tell you this, we're freer on this mattress than you are. And this actually spawned conversations because, as I say, these were not inherently evil men. They were young men who had no love in their lives, and they certainly had no love in their theology. So, and they wanted truth. A lot of them had been sold a lie by government and communities, and they'd had a lot of dreams shattered. And they wanted to know what was true and what was not. And inevitably, if you're there for 24 hours a day with at least 7 of them, some of them actually engaged to the point where we had Bible studies, and they wanted to know the basis of our faith. And so for us, it became an opportunity to witness, to really understand what made some of these men tick. Now, not all of them, because, you know, the majority were definitely not interested in communicating. But within it, there was a group of 3 who became increasingly interested in the person of Jesus Christ. So it was like a Bible study increasingly as the time went. Now, that isn't to say it was easy. It wasn't easy. There were, you know, enormous ups and downs. But in the middle of that, the take-home, I would say, is that the Bible was fundamental to our survival.
Premier Christianity magazine. In this month's issue,
Artie Kendall unpacks the problem with living for the praise of others. Missionaries Shirley and David Donovan share their harrowing story of being kidnapped in Nigeria and how God protected them during their 22-day ordeal. And we speak to Louis Giglio about his life-changing ministry to university students. Plus, Tim Hughes reveals how he spends his money.
for your free copy, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample.
Just to go back for a moment, you mentioned that tragically they shot and they killed Ian quite early on, I think. Why was it? Did you understand at the time, or do you even understand now why he was singled out and why he didn't make it and the rest of you did?
I don't think he was singled out. I think he was standing up and we were sitting down. We don't wholly know why, but somebody said it was to teach us a lesson. Maybe it was that. Maybe it's because the guy who shot it was on drugs and he didn't like our singing. Maybe I don't know. But what I do know is that through his death, there's been a revival in that area of people coming to Christ, so much so that we have 8 boatloads of people coming for discipleship camps every fortnight in a way that we never had before he gave his life. So as a seed dies in the ground, a plant grows and there is fruit. So God, again, I have to come back to the fact that God is sovereign in all situations, and so I can surmise and I have ideas, but ultimately what I do know is God uses all things for his glory.
I think around the time of his death, I think there were even press reports in this country and some confusion over exactly what had happened. I think there was even press reports suggesting that he'd died of some other cause, or I think you'd been instructed at one point to not let on the fact that he had been murdered and instead say that he'd refused food. And tell me a little bit more about that and the kind of confusion of the time of what exactly had happened with him.
I'm not going to go into that area, if that's okay. I mean, he's got his family, and I don't think all that speculation. I don't think it's helpful to go into that.
But as you said, you were witness to his death, and that must have been an incredibly difficult thing, incredibly traumatic thing to witness. Yes,
of course. I mean, again, the salacious points of his death were. I don't need to. I mean, sorry. I mean, I know you want details. I don't think that's helpful for people. He was. All I need to say is that he was shot.
Yes. No,
he
I'm
was
not.
Shot in front of us.
I'm not asking for any more details than that.
Yeah. I've just got to respect his family here.
Of course.
I mean, at the end of the day, he was shot in front of us, and it was traumatic. But I think the point I'd like to make is that when we saw him, after he was shot, we naturally assumed we were going to be shot next, because you're in the middle of the jungle. You don't know where the shot came from, and we had jumped into the flood, and we just perceived that there was a man with a gun circling around somewhere in the bush we couldn't see in the jungle, and we were going to be shot, and you were completely helpless. Now, as a Christian, that, to me, and this is an important point as opposed to his death, that what do you do as a Christian in that situation? Do you mumble half-baked prayers, which is probably what I did? Do you think of swimming away and just trying to escape and do your best? What do you do, and what do you actually believe at that point of view? Because you're looking at eternity potentially in the next second or two. And it's a very strange experience, because suddenly all your church attendances, your Bible studies, your home groups, your devotionals, all your bits and bobs count for absolutely nothing, because what you want to know is, am I saved by the blood of Christ, and am I going to see him if I get a bullet in my head in the next second? Because Ian was taken instantly, absolutely instantly, into the presence of Christ. And what does that look like? What is that? What is the experience of that? And I was almost having that conversation whilst I was expecting a bullet. And so it's a very, very salutary experience to actually think I'm going to die in a second or two. How do I process that? And to be quite honest, it was just white noise I experienced, except I could say that I'm helpless and I'm throwing myself on your mercy. And I guess that's a bit like the thief on the cross, because he had nowhere to take it. He just said, remember me. It's like a cry out. It's just a plea. That's all you can do. But it certainly shows our frailty in the situation.
It sounds like 22 days of obviously extreme lows, and yet also paradoxically some, and I'm thinking particularly of what you spoke about earlier in terms of the Bible, paradoxically some extreme highs as well in terms of finding yourself in a completely bizarre situation of witnessing and sharing your faith with people who had murdered your friend in cold blood. I guess the question I want to ask is what have been have there been ramifications of those 22 days since then? I mean, the phrase that comes to mind for myself would be something like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Have those sorts of things happened since because of the ordeal that you went through?
Funnily enough, I was just speaking at Christian Medical Fellowship at the weekend in London, and a doctor asked me exactly that question. The answer is no. There was no PTSD whatsoever, absolutely none. And I believe that is because Christ was there and walked us through the whole experience and has continued to do so. I think also because it showed us the reality of Christ, the reality of God's holding us in that situation. And since then, it's given us certainly a new sobriety in life, the ability to see the wood from the trees, and also I rejoice every day for the freedom, because actually, to be captive in any sense is really, it's a really horrible thing not to be able to get up or stand or do anything without asking. So I think I'm sure anyone who's been in prison feels exactly that. The absolute appreciation of freedom that I rejoice in every day, and also the joy of the creation every day, and the privilege of having a second chance to witness and be serious about who Christ is in our life, and to testify. And that's why I'm happy to come on and talk about it, not because, okay, so yes, it's a good story, but the important thing is actually to point people to Christ and say that everyone has their own hostage situation, be it bereavement or death, depression, illness. Everyone has them. Just for us, it was that. But actually, the key thing in these situations is to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And in doing so, we can lay aside every weight and every besetting sin that enables us to run with patience a race that is set before us, from Hebrews 12. And I think that's the key thing I would want people to know, that actually He is our sufficiency. He is our all in all in any situation where it seems like the pressure of the physical is going to supersede the spiritual, and that is not the case.
Yeah. I was reading, I think, quite early on when you were taken captive, you managed to get a guitar and were even singing Amazing Grace together, which of course reminded me of the stories in the New Testament of the early Christians who were in prison and singing hymns and songs. Tell me more about that event and what was going through your mind as that was happening, because again, a kind of story. It's very difficult, I think, for most Christians in this country to get their head around what must that be like, and yet you've lived through that exact experience.
Yeah. I suppose, as you say, I think a lot of Christians are in difficult situations, and you have to decide where to turn to for solace. And the joy, I think, of the old hymns are such that the words are a shorthand expression of what you want to say, but perhaps you don't have the words at that time to actually say it. And Amazing Grace is one such hymn, isn't it? It's so affirmatory of what Christ has done for us, but also it recognizes our weakness. So I find that strangely, be it on a platform in a flood in Nigeria or sitting in a church in the UK, I think when we delve into the words of some of the, I have to say, the older hymns, we see a poetry and a depth of Christian experience of the author that actually we can ride on the back of, because actually it gives voice to the words which perhaps we don't have. So even in that situation and being over here, at the time it felt very much like just being in church, being in a state where you're actually affirming where your foundation is, and that's in Christ.
So I'd love to hear a bit more about, of course, the rescue and you coming out of that situation. As I say, it was 22 days in captivity. Did you have any kind of inkling towards the end of those 22 days that you might be out of that situation, and that there would be hope that you would survive and ultimately come back here to the UK? Did you have any kind of inkling towards the end of those 22 days that something might be about to happen?
I think that all the way through, there were little blips of hope that something was happening, an intermediate was involved. But then as soon as you were given a little bit of hope and you were told tomorrow everything's going to, and tomorrow came and it didn't, anytime you heard anything positive, you were pretty sure you couldn't bank on that. And sure enough, the next day it didn't happen, and therefore you began to not trust any messages of good hope. So we, at the beginning, felt we were going to be out in a couple of days, but actually as the weeks began to go, we realized that here were a gang who normally operated in the local, and they had no concept of international situations, and therefore they had no understanding of how to extract money internationally. You know, I think their view was you get on an airplane with an Adidas bag of fivers, and it just isn't like that. And when they realized that, they were pretty much in the dark as well. So that, when you don't have trust in the competency of your captors, that's quite a chilling situation. And that's why they were thinking of selling us on and doing other things. So it led to enormous periods of uncertainty. So it was a roller coaster of hope and despair, oscillating backwards and forwards. Yes, I said so. We didn't. I mean, even on the last day, as I wrote, we had a sense of despair on the last day that nothing was happening. You know, the flood was going down. Everyone had run out of drugs, and it was just everyone was ill. It was like sewage everywhere. It was just awful, and so you do have a sense of despair. But then you just felt there had to be a purpose in this in some way. But as I said, if God is sovereign, it may not be the way you want it to end, and it's coming to that acceptance which is the key.
So take me through that final day and exactly what happened from your point of view on that day.
Well, the last day, as I say, we were pretty much in despair because the flood was going down fast, and the dry season begins at the beginning of December, and you could see the roots of the trees now sort of very obviously, and that concentrated the detritus and sewage. 17 of us on the platform and not a toilet. And this is stagnant flood, and they were cooking, and there was just rubbish in the flood, and just oil and thickened insects and everything else. And a number of them had malaria. The guy who cooked us our bowl of noodles every day had dysentery. We thought, if we get ill, there's not a lot of hope because we had no immunity at all to anything, and a lot of insects and everything else. And so. And they were getting irritated and frustrated as well because a lot of the gang who didn't know what was happening were equally irritated and despairing. So we awoke with a normal day of, not knowing what was going to happen. It was very hot, and normally the couple who come from being on duty overnight in a canoe take drugs, and there weren't any drugs, so everyone is coming down, they're all irritable, and they normally play rap on phones. And everything just suddenly went quiet, and we heard a song that, instead of being rap off a mobile phone, this sounded like, it had bass, it had ambience, it had surround sound. It sounded like, a really quality hi-fi of some type. And it was this song, God will make a way. Where there seems to be no way, God will make a way today. And we'd never heard a song like that. I'd never heard the song, Don Lowen, I believe. And it just played. And you could hear the sound around the whole of this clearing. And you couldn't hear anyone speak. None of the phones were going. It was just this song. And as it faded, all the phones began again, the cacophony and the shouting and the swearing and all this, that, and the other. We looked at each other, and Alanna said, "Did you hear that?" And we just couldn't process this, except that something was going to happen, but we didn't know what. And the day carried on its normal slow pace of the petty arguments and infighting and ablutions and bits and bobs. And then the general, as he was called, the leader of the gang, normally came under the cover of darkness at night, but on this occasion he came at 4 o'clock or so in the afternoon, but not on his own on his boat. He came with all his cronies. These were quite a toxic and malign bunch of men who never interacted, just sat on the boat at the side of the platform smoking, and he got on the platform with all his cronies and they sat there, and then he just asked me via the interpreter, although he could have addressed me in English, I knew he spoke a bit of English, "What are you going to say about your number 2? And I said, "Well, we don't have a number 2. Ian's a number 1. And I said, "I'll say whatever you want." And he said, "Well, you say he died of starvation." I said, fine. And we sat there, and nothing happened, and a few hours went by, and the evening began to come, and it began to get dark, and then there were instructions, and a couple of guys went off on a canoe, and they brought another speedboat out of the jungle that was covered in vines, and a big 75 horsepower engine on the back, and we were told to get up off the mattress, out of the net, and we were told to get on the boat. And I remember as I got on the boat, I realized we were not going to be coming back. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that this was a final event. And I just put my hand on the shoulder of this young man who was most engaged regarding the gospel, and I said, "Get out of this madness." And he looked at me, and that was it, and then I was pushed onto the boat. And we had life jackets on, and we had sort of T-shirts tied over our heads, and we were told to bend down. And I thought we were going out onto the main river, but we were taken into the jungle even more, and we were bent over because branches were sort of scraping us on the shoulders and head. We carried on for about an hour and a half, and it didn't feel good because we were going into a remoter area. And I thought, well, what's going to happen here? And we couldn't talk, so we couldn't, although each of us were never next to each other, we were just bent over in our own thoughts. And then the boat stopped, and it was dark now, and we heard voices. And we couldn't hear the general's boat. We were on one boat, and he was on a different boat, but he somehow disappeared. And suddenly from up ahead, we heard a real accelerating engine, and this boat roared towards us and then stopped, and there was a general on it I could hear, and he was shouting something, and then he drove off back from the direction that we had come, so he disappeared behind us. And then the guy started our engine, and we carried on for about 400 feet, and then they just tore everything off us and said, go. And for the first time, we saw land. It was a sort of embankment. There were two guys reaching down with their hands, and they pulled us out of the boat onto sort of a clearing, and there was a 4x4 with its doors open and sirens and everything else, and some of the army. And that was how it ended. And it was abrupt, it was sudden, it was extraordinary that God had made a way where there seemed to be no way, and he made a way that day.
Amazing story of how you were rescued, obviously from your point of view. But I imagine, well, I know there would have been an awful lot of things happening behind the scenes that you wouldn't have been aware of while you were captured. Presumably, though, you've since found out some of those things. So can you almost sort of tell that story again, but from the point of view of what was happening behind the scenes and who was involved in order to get you guys freed?
Well, obviously, behind the scenes were our sons who went through a really difficult time, and, you know, give testimony to their resilience, because they were not told an awful lot, but they had gone through an awful lot in terms of training. If they got phone calls, and the Foreign Office were involved, and I can't speak highly enough of the Foreign Office. They were absolutely amazing with regards to our family. My brother was amazing. He was in close liaison with the Foreign Office, as was Ian's brother and his wife, and the Nigerian government, I believe, were involved, and the Nigerian Secret Service, and all the communities in which we worked. They had gone up even to give the kidnappers some money to give us food, because the kidnappers didn't even have any food to feed us. So unbeknownst to us, the communities in which we worked had actually given them money so we could actually eat. So there was support from every level, internationally, locally, regionally, the Delta Security Forces, the Army. You know, amazing, and the National Crime Agency as well in the UK, who were incredible, and after we got back were so supportive. The guys in the National Crime Agency and the Foreign Office, and even the High Consulates in Nigeria, such human, gracious and kind people. Really touching, even to the point where my mother was terminally ill, and they went and visited her for a couple of hours just to keep her company. You know, just utter humanity.
Yeah.
So, but in terms of what happened, I've no idea.
Really?
No, I've no idea at all. I mean, obviously it's machinations, and our family were not told. But this is what happens behind the scenes, and it's just incredible to be on the receiving end. Yeah. But what did touch me was the humanity of the people who work in those organisations. Extraordinary people.
So I find that surprising that to this day. I mean, if I were to ask you, do you know ultimately what was the clincher? What was the reason why they let you go? You just would have to answer, I don't know, to that question.
I don't know. They wanted a lot of money. They wanted £2.4 million, but the British government don't pay ransoms, and our family certainly don't have that.
I guess you can rule some things out. So obviously you can rule out the fact that your family didn't give any money. And the British government say they wouldn't have given any money. But as for the actual reason, we perhaps will never know.
I have no idea why they released us on that day. As I say, the communities in which we work were involved, and I don't know, amnesties and local government, and I heard politicians being involved with the gang. I mean, all sorts of theories. But, you know, Nigeria is a tortuous place. But I know the Nigerians were incredibly helpful and were closely involved. But the details I genuinely can't answer you.
I wanted to end by talking about forgiveness, because you've already said to many journalists that you have forgiven your captors, which I guess from a Christian point of view, I guess I could say, well, yes, in theory, as a Christian, I am called to forgive everyone. But the actual practice of that, the actual decision to forgive someone who has committed that level of sin against you, surely, to put it mildly, can't be easy. So tell me a bit about that journey for you of forgiveness, and what that has looked like for you in terms of that Christian principle being practically outworked in your life.
I think we knew the sort of people who took us because the community in which we work were the very sort of people who took hostages. So we knew the personalities of these sorts of people. But with always, people are not all evil. Even the darkest people, are capable of redemption. And as a Christian, we have to keep that in view, that God loves all people. But I think forgiveness is not a sort of warm, fuzzy feeling. It's like love. It's perceived as something that is soft. But actually, forgiveness and love, I think, are similar things because they're very active. You actively have to love someone. It's not a passive emotion, and forgiveness is not passive. It's active. And I think when you get to know people in that situation, I saw the darkness in them, but I also saw some good in some of them as well. Just broken people who have been dealt a really bad hand. And sometimes as a GP, I see patients who how can they be in that situation? And then you read a psychiatrist or forensic report on them, and you can see that actually if I'd been dealt that pack of cards, I could have gone down that way too. As I say, forgiveness is active, and I look back on what they did, and yes, there were some things that were just absolutely horrendous, and I think, but that is what man is capable of, and I know also what I have done. And if I start to point the finger at them, I need to point the finger at me, and that again is something which is active. So at times, I reflect on things, and at times even then I thought I could pick up a gun and do something. But then you just have to look at yourself, I think, at the end of the day and see what you've done and what you're capable of, murder in your heart. And I think as a Christian, if we're truly reflective, we see that actually we can't hold on to things. It ultimately is destructive for yourself as well.
You're now based back here in the UK. I imagine you have friends, contacts in Nigeria, but I imagine returning is probably out of the question.
We've been back twice. We're going back again in 3 weeks' time, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Strikes me as quite a brave thing to do.
Well, the clinic's off bounds at the current time because there's another gang in the area doing exactly the same thing who's actually related to the gang who took us. So it's ongoing, and the politics in that area are particularly difficult at the time. So again, it's the other aspect. We have to be wise. So we meet with the team in an area that's just not quite as dangerous as that area. So it's going on well, and as I say, the clinic is thriving, the team are thriving, people are coming to Christ, and the work is continuing well. So it's a blessing.
Well, that's a wonderful way people can support you then by purchasing the book and the funds going back into the work that continues remarkably in that part of the world. Would you ever consider moving out there on a more permanent basis?
No. I mean, there's a mission field here in this country. I'm a GP full-time, 3/4 time in a practice outside of Cambridge, and I see that there's an awful lot of... the Lord showed me quite clearly there's a mission field here. You don't have to go to... And also, I think we've always said over the past 5 years that this is a Nigerian mission, and what we're doing is empowering our brothers and sisters to take it over ultimately, and we gently are stepping back. And that's been on the cards for a long time, way before the kidnap, and with farms and a school and other projects to make it self-sustaining. We want that to be a legacy for them out there, our brothers and sisters out there, to take over.
Well, that's a wonderful place to leave it. David Donovan, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to me today.
Thank you very much.
I'm Sam Hales. You have been listening to the Profile podcast. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I certainly was blown away by David's testimony. You can read all about that story as well in the latest issue of Premier Christianity magazine. If you're not already a subscriber, why not request a free copy of this issue? Not only will you be able to read about David Donovan, but we've got R.T. Kendall writing for us this month on living for an audience of one. Our interviewee this month is Louis Giglio, so you can read all about the spread of the Passion conferences in the USA that he's set up and how that's become a worldwide movement of Christian students. You can also read about how Tim Hughes and Moiwa spend their money. We've been talking to Tim Hughes, Moiwa, Catherine Hill from Care for the Family, and also Natalie Williams, who works for Jubilee Plus, about Christian attitudes towards money. And we've actually quizzed them on how they spend their cash. Read that in the latest issue. There's so much to enjoy. Also, Glenn Scrivener writing on Down syndrome, abortion, and the disturbing consequences of getting rid of God. A very powerful piece indeed. Another one of my favourites is Chris Llewellyn this month, writing about the end of hustle. Chris, of course, is the lead singer of the band Wren Collective, and he's got some fantastic insights to share, not just on worship, but on a host of other subjects, and he writes every month in the magazine. The other regular columnist is N.T. Wright. The tricky question that Tom Wright is tackling this month is, the traditional view of salvation says that if someone is not a follower of Jesus, they'll spend eternity in hell. Do you agree? Read N.T. Wright's answer to that question in the latest issue, plus all those other articles. Get it free now at premierchristianity.com/free sample. That's it for now on the show. We will see you next time.